Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Classroom Matters podcast with me, your host, Christy Houle. And today I am delighted to be sitting down and talking with Cyndi Burnett, who is the Director of Possibilities for Creativity and Education. Cyndi has been teaching others how to be more creative for the last 20 years and is on a mission to empower educators to infuse creative thinking into every classroom in the world. She has taught deliberate creative thinking at the college level for 20 years, and her online course, Ignite Your Everyday Creativity, reached over 100,000 people. She has also written 2 books, weaving creativity into every strand of your curriculum, and my personal favorite, My Sandwich is a Spaceship. Creative thinking for parents with young children. Cyndi, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, so I'm so excited. So I know my listeners, the minute that I said my sandwich is a spaceship, they're like, what? They're going to be listening to that because that's very intriguing. It's a great title for a book, and we're going to talk about that later in the show. But I really wanted just to start with giving our listeners a little bit of background about who you are, what you do, and sort of your journey to get to the work that you're doing today.
Sure. So when I was a child, I was very artistic. I loved performing. And even at a very young age, I can remember being in the dance classroom, being in the dance studio. And I would feel as if my dance shoes were my conduit to my imagination, because every time I put on my dance shoes, I could do anything I wanted in my head into my body. And I remember driving in the back seat of my parents' car, and I would be listening to Michael Jackson, and I would be choreographing a show. I mean, even as young as like 6 and 7. And I choreographed my first show when I was 11. And so I loved musical theater. When I became a teenager, I decided to study theater. And I went to get my first degree, which was in theater and dance. And I moved to New York City after I graduated with my first degree. And I landed in my very first day in the city, a first national Broadway tour. And so I ended up spending 6 months on the road with A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which is a Broadway musical, and had my equity card, was making great money. And I finished the tour and I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And so I came back home to my hometown of Buffalo, New York, and I was sitting with an old voice teacher of mine, Karen Whelan, and she said to me, what are you thinking about? And I said, I just don't know what I want to do with my life. And she said, well, Cyndi, don't ask, what do you want to do? What do you want to learn about? And I said, I want to learn about creativity. Now, this was back in 1999. And The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron had come out a few years before, which I read and loved. And when I read this book, I really loved the piece around blocks and barriers. So what helps us become creative and not creative? And up until that point, my whole life was as an artist and as a performing artist. And so, it was very intuitive and it was this emotional, intuitive piece of me. So I said, I want to study creativity. And within 24 hours of that happening, I found the oldest degree granting program in creativity in the world at SUNY Buffalo State, which is literally, a couple streets away from me, a couple towns over. So I went and I contacted them and they said, we're actually starting classes this week. Would you like to come in as a non-matriculated student and a Master of Science in Creative Studies? So I said, yes, this sounds amazing. I had no idea what I had signed up for. But when I walked into my first day and I was dressed like an artist, I remember having like black leather tights on and, the black jacket and leather jacket. And my hair was like really long and wild. Like people would stop me and ask me if I was like a rock star or something back then. And so I walk into this class and there's like a teacher next to me and there's a business person on the other side of me. And I'm like, am I in the right classroom? And they're saying, yeah, this is creative studies. I'm like, creative studies? They're like, this isn't the arts of creativity. This is the science of creativity. So I started my Master of Science and I felt really out of place, but it was a different part of creativity for me. So I was tapping into the scientific, cognitive, rational, semantic side of creativity that I didn't even know existed. And I really found so much value in learning this deliberate creative process. But when I graduated, they brought me on to start teaching with them. And that was in 2001. And I was, by day, I was teaching these deliberate cognitive, rational, semantic problem solving methodologies. And then at night, I was choreographing, men's glee clubs and high school musicals. And I was still doing a lot of choreography. So it felt, I was saying I am doing creativity, but it was creativity from two totally different perspectives. So I would go to the artist and I would say, there's this cognitive side. Oh, no. What I do is not deliberate. It's not cognitive. It's emotional. It's intuitive. I'm like, oh boy. So then I go to the scientists and they'd say, oh no, we don't do that fluffy artist stuff. Right. So I have spent most of my career focused on bridging that challenge and the language between the artistic side of creativity and expressive side and the scientific problem solving side of creativity. And that work is what I've been doing for probably the last 15 years. And then how do we bring that into education?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting that you mentioned there's two different sides to creativity, right? There's the artistic side, the fluffy, intuitive side, and then there's the scientific side of creativity. And a lot of times those two things are extremely hard for people to mesh. And so that actually leads me to my next question is, when we're talking about education and classrooms and students and teachers at a K-12 level or even a homeschool environment, how do you define creativity? And how does that usually differ from what people see it as? I think people have the word creativity in their mind and they think they know what that means. But how do you get people to see the two different sides of that?
That's a great question. So let me just start with a standard definition of creativity is the generation of novel or new and useful ideas. Now, when I work with educators, I talk about appropriate because we want our students to be generating new ideas that are also appropriate. How does that land in education is what I've been working on, and that bridge between the science and the arts. And what I've uncovered is that there are a whole set of skills that E. Paul Torrance, who was known as the father of creativity in education, had developed over the course of his lifetime. And E. Paul Torrance's skills are known as the leap skills or beyonder skills. And these beyonder skills he's uncovered as part of a longitudinal study that looks at highly creative individuals. So when you start to look at these skills, you start to see things like being open-minded, being a risk taker, being able to generate lots of ideas, being original, producing lots of ideas. So the way I frame it for teachers is, imagine you want to become a good swimmer. You don't say, well, if you want to be a good swimmer, you just need to do one thing. There's lots of things you need to learn, right? You need to learn how to kick. You need to learn how to breathe. You need to learn how to dive and turn and, all of these different upper body movements. And the same is true with a creative person, because it's not just about one thing. It's about curiosity and wonder. It's about playfulness and humor. It's about using our bodies in different ways and using music in the classroom. It's about taking risks and being able to tolerate ambiguity and complexity. So you start to look at all these different skills and you see these skills as the bridge between the arts and sciences, because you imagine a skill like curiosity in the sciences. And if you're teaching that in the sciences, that's also going to transfer over to the expressive side of creativity and being curious in the way that you express yourself. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And so how do you teach that to someone? Or can you teach that to someone? Because, as a teacher, if you're teaching third grade and, kids generally, before COVID, I don't know if they necessarily do as much now. And that was something you and I were discussing, before we started recording, was the lack of opportunities for students in schools right now because of COVID. But, my kids went to, when I was teaching third grade, my students went to music, they went to art, they went to all of these classes that taught that. So I didn't really feel like I needed to. I was kind of scared of it too, I'll be honest with you. And I'm sure you get that a lot. I was sort of scared of it, and I didn't know if I could ever learn how to not only be creative, but how to teach that to others. So talk a little bit about how easy or difficult it is to learn how to be creative.
It's actually really easy when you break it down to these underlying skills and traits that I mentioned earlier. And I'll send you a link to a sheet with 20 skills, and you can download this from our website. It's free. It shows all the skills. We also have little characters that have been designed by children's book author Barney Salzberg, because he's worked with me on a lot of the stuff. We also have a lot of warm-ups that you can do on our YouTube station, which is called Creativity, where you can watch these videos that will give you some simple warm-ups you can do in the classroom or at home. In fact, during COVID, a lot of parents were having their children do some of these activities with grandparents because it was just a playful and fun way for them to connect. But if you look at, let's just take a skill like curiosity. Okay. Can we teach kids to be more curious, which is one of the skills around being a creative person? So I'm going to ask you a question, Christy. Are you ready?
Oh, yes.
I'm showing you an item. What is it?
A pencil.
It is a pencil. How long have you been using pencils for?
40 plus years.
40 plus years, me too. So if I were going to ask you to generate a list of as many questions you could about a pencil, could you do it?
Sure.
How many questions do you think you could come up with?
Probably 15 to 20.
15 to 20, that's pretty average. Yeah. Which is, what I would, that's not saying that you're average. I'm just saying that's what an average person can come up with in 3 minutes, 20 questions about a pencil. But we've been using them for 40 years, right? So how is it that we could come up with 20 questions about something as simple as a pencil? Now, let's transfer that to what students are learning in class. So everything that I do in my own work around weaving creativity is all about incremental changes. So instead of having students read, I have 2 children of my own, they come home with this homework and it's read this passage, answer these questions, right? Standard homework. Okay, so instead of having them answer these questions, what I want you to do is generate a list of 20 questions that you didn't understand about that particular lesson, right? So instead of having them generate the answers, you're having them generate the questions. And then you start with those conversations around the questions they have around the content. So that's one simple way, right, that you can bring in curiosity into your classroom. One of the things I love to do around that same assignment is to give your students 20 Post-its and say, come back with 20 questions about what we just learned, what your homework is. And then when they come in, you have them post them on the wall. And as you enter the classroom and you start the discussion, you don't have to ask students, what questions do you have? They've already generated them and they're all over your classroom wall. Like, what a great way to encourage curiosity, right? So there are just many, many simple things, probably things that teachers that are listening, if you're listening and you're a good teacher and you're listening to improve yourself, you're doing a lot already in the classroom. And that's one of the things I love about people when I watch teachers open up. And I have a new book that just came out, which is called 20 Lessons to Weave Creative Thinking into Your Curriculum. But what happens when people go through my books is they say, I'm already doing this. I'm already doing this one. Oh, I've done this before, and that's one of the joys of watching them. I'm like, yeah, that's because all of these ideas came from other teachers and workshops I've done with them. And there are things that you are doing that are creative. If you're good, if you're doing great work as an educator, you're doing creative things naturally, but it's about making it explicit in your classroom. So today, kids, I want you to get curious. Okay. So I want you to take out your pencils and we're going to generate some questions around the pencil. And then we're going to go to the content and we're going to look at some content. And I want you to get curious about your content. So celebrating the different skills that are surrounding that creative person.
And I think what's so important about the work that you're doing really is sort of wrapped up in a lot of things that you just said. And the fact that if people are listening, they're like, oh, I never thought about that, is because you are providing tools and resources and strategies and ideas based around things that folks feel comfortable doing and not so far out of the norm. Because do you get a sense from folks that you work with and that you talk to that there is a fear around the word, I'm doing air quotes, I know nobody can see me right now, but creativity in the classroom? Does that seem to strike fear? It's like math, right? Math and creativity.
Yes. Yes, absolutely, Christy. And it's funny because just 2 weeks ago, I was doing a workshop for 70 educators. And at the start of the workshop, I asked them, how many of you consider yourselves creative? And about half of them raised their hands, which is again typical. I would expect half of them would raise their hands. And I said, okay, let me phrase this a different way. How many of you have been faced with a challenge in the last week inside of your classroom where you had to come up with a new idea or solution that you couldn't just Google the answer, or that you just couldn't turn to a teammate and say, what should I do about this? That you had to invent a new idea or solution. And then all of their hands, of course, were raised. I've only had one person who said that's never happened to me. Almost every time I've asked that question to educators, they say, yeah, that's all I do is try to invent ideas. Because, as educators, you don't thrive unless you problem solve, unless you think of new ideas. Because if, you have a student who's got a challenge and you're trying to work through the challenge with that student, that is being creative. You're just being, if we look at it from the scientific perspective, you're being a good creative problem solver, and many people don't look at themselves as creative because they're not artistic. And one of the things I am constantly trying to break down is you don't have to be artistic to be creative. That if you are able to come up with new ideas for anything that you do, then you are being creative.
Mm-hmm. And that's really the difference, right? It's not the same as being artistic. And I think that's where a lot of teachers and parents get nervous when they hear that word. And, I love the example that you just provided, because I also want listeners to know that what you do and what you teach is not just around certain disciplines, but it can really be applied to all areas of the school day. And so, for example, my son was in tutoring. I'm thinking about math right now because my son is struggling a little bit in his math course. And so he's doing some outside tutoring. And I watched last night as this amazing tutor had to figure out a way to explain to him that both sides of the equation had to be equal. And she just was not getting through to him. And so she gets up and she's thinking to herself, and here's where the creativity came in, and she probably didn't even realize she was doing it. She got up and she came back and she had a bag of peanut M&Ms, a bottle of glue, a pencil or a pen, and a Post-it with an equal sign on it, where she was layering each side of the equal sign with different amounts of M&Ms, a pencil on this side, a thing of glue on this side, right? That was creativity.
Absolutely.
She had to get really creative really quickly. And so being an educator, like you said, is being creative to begin with, because you're constantly problem solving. But I want to talk a little bit about the creativity and the problem solving that folks have had to do over the last year and a half, 2 years with COVID, going from, normal brick and mortar schools, everyone's at school every day, to we don't know what we're doing, we have to problem solve. So have you seen a rise in folks really coming to you and needing or wanting assistance with this? Because COVID has really gotten rid of a lot of our, what we would call, quote unquote, creative learning opportunities.
I think actually this pandemic has unfortunately in many ways put us back in terms of creativity. And the reason is, if you think about our school systems, you walk into classrooms, students are sitting in rows, facing forward, listening to the teacher talk, and there's not a lot of interaction because of the pandemic, and because there's mask wearing and they have to keep the students away from each other. So it takes a different level of creativity to be able to tackle that, to say, how might I do this in a different way? Or how might I engage the students in a different way? Or how might I get them working together, but not actually physically together? So there has been so much creativity, especially when we went distance. I mean, I read a statistic, and I don't know if this is true, but 50% of teachers had to teach online, had never taught a course online. So you take all these teachers and all of a sudden they're thrown online. You have to be inventive in that way. But in terms of creative teaching and learning, I think teachers they're completely burned out. It's very challenging trying to teach with a mask on, as I am aware, because I've been going into classrooms and working with students, and it's exhausting. And so to say, well, I want to think through and change something or do something different, it takes a lot of extra effort. And I don't know, and I understand that a lot of teachers don't have that kind of capacity at this time. But I always say, I'm here for you if you need anything. In fact, one of my goals for 2022 is to do lesson makeovers And I have the YouTube station I mentioned, Creativity, where I would bring on an educator and say, let's take a lesson you really don't like and let's do a makeover, and let's integrate, infuse a creative thinking skill in, and let's make it really fun, and let's build the materials, and let's make those accessible to everyone. So that's something I'll be doing in 2022.
So what are some things that you're doing out of your possibilities for creativity and education? What kind of resources are folks going to find when they visit you there?
Well, we have been building, and most of these resources are available for free. So we have a whole course on creative problem solving that's animated. So when we hit the pandemic, we actually had that course that we were going to launch for a cost, and we decided just to put it all up on YouTube so that teachers could use it for free. So if you want to teach some of the principles of creative problem solving, that's available for free. We have the YouTube station I mentioned with Barney Salzberg. Each of those 20 creative thinking skills, Barney and I have done a warm-up activity that teachers can use. And it's great. It's just great fun. It's different little activities you could do either online, you could do it in person. You could have masks on. One of the activities was, imagine you sneeze in your mask and what does it look like? And then fold your paper up like that. Now take it out and draw a picture based on what you're seeing. So it's all about like just inventive thinking and playfulness. And I have the books, and you can download a lot of the chapters for the books. And I always promise teachers, I'm like, if for some reason you're in a financial strait, just email me and say, can I have a PDF? And I'll find a way to get it to you. Because one of my goals in doing this work is to help any teacher that comes to me and says, I really want these resources, I want to make a difference in my classroom, that I make those available in any capacity I can, while still surviving,
And how do you support teachers? Because I know a big conversation around the world of doing more creative things with your students in the classroom is the ability to measure a student's creativity, and that can be a problem. Because, I remember when I was younger in art class, I was so scared that my art piece wasn't going to look like anything like the example on the board. And that always made me a little less excited, right, to do it, because I knew that I wasn't going to be graded according to what I produced, just more according to if it looked the same. So talk a little bit about the ability to measure creativity and what that should really look like as an educator.
That is a fantastic question, Christy. And I think that it's a very challenging one for teachers, because they feel like if it can't be assessed, then what's the purpose, right? And that's the unfortunate piece of the assessment piece. However, if you have a rubric that says, I want this to be novel, or I want this, is this new to you, or is this useful to you? And you even just put those two pieces in, that's a starting place. So is this new to you? Is this useful? The other piece is to have students self-assess. So one of the things that I always found interesting when I've had students grade their own work is the reflection piece. So I believe I deserve this grade because of this. And you can do a pre and post, here's what I'm hoping to do and hoping to achieve. My post is this. So how much effort did you expect to put in? How much were you motivated by a project? What was the outcome? What did the outcome look like? Is it aesthetically pleasing? Was it supposed to be aesthetically pleasing? Because that is the thing about creativity, is especially if you're giving students choice to create something. And actually, we just had a blog post on choice. One of my contributors wrote a blog post on giving students choice and what happens when you give students this opportunity to select what they want to create, right? Is how do you assess it? And a lot of that can come from self-reflection, because there's so much beauty in being able to look at something and, you put your work of art up there, or I put my invention over here. How do I know that this was my best work? And I can tell you from experience in doing this with lots of students, they always grade themselves worse than I would have graded them.
Yeah.
And then if I don't agree with their assessment of their work, then we talk about that, because otherwise, if you're grading people and, I'll never forget that my son received a really low grade on a diorama. It was like a 50 something, and I'm like, okay, he's like fourth grade, right? Just, did he really need to get a 50 on a diorama? Because that kind of stuff can stain you for life. Like that makes people say, I'm not creative, shuts down the whole conversation. So instead of that, to say, all right, let's look at what were you supposed to do? What was it supposed to look like? How can you create that? Where did you fall short? Did you put the effort in? What resources should you have used? Like really using that metacognition to reflect and think about how to make it better is going to be 100 times more beneficial than the educator looking at it and giving it a grade based on what they see, because they're only seeing the actual outcome when the actual purpose of this type of work is in the process.
Yeah. And I think too, along with that's a great example of putting more emphasis on, grading the content and what you actually wanted the student to master, the knowledge and the creativity not being a part of that grade. Because it really is, you're right, it really does set kids up, I believe, for failure sometimes when they just feel defeated and then they're embarrassed and they don't really feel creative, because you want children to enjoy the process.
Yes.
And if they're not enjoying the process and they're just trying to get it to look like everybody else's, there's no creativity in that any longer. And it's just, they're doing it because it was an assignment and they're trying to get a good grade, and the creativity is right out the window.
Yep.
We could solve all the problems of the world, Cyndi, couldn't we?
I definitely think so.
I think we could. Okay. So I want to wrap up really quickly, but I want to give listeners an idea too about your books and what they're going to find when they get done listening to this podcast and they type into Amazon the titles of your 2 books, and they're going to figure, they want to know what they're going to be looking at. So your first book, Weaving Creativity into Every Strand of Your Curriculum. We kind of touched on some of that right now. And My Sandwich is a Spaceship. So what are our listeners going to see and get when they look at those 2 books?
Well, let me start with Weaving. So Weaving came out of a number, I ran dozens of workshops with educators on ways they were integrating these different creative thinking skills into their classroom. And that book is a compilation of all of those ideas from educators. And then I brought in 30 experts that are trained in creativity and are educators in different fields and different age levels. And they gave me ideas to support each of those as well. So they gave some of the builds. Now, what was interesting is after I came out with that book and I started doing workshops on weaving, then people came to me and said, okay, can you give me a script? I'm like, oh, this script piece sort of went against every grain in my bone. However, it kept coming up. So I thought, how might I? And what I did is I worked together with Lola Schnapp, who is one of my former graduate students and a teacher in Chile. And we created the 20 lessons to weave creative thinking into your curriculum, which is the second book of the series. And that book takes each of the skills and it gives you a full template lesson on how to heighten anticipation, how to deepen expectations, and how to extend the learning in each of those creative thinking skills. So you could take a lesson that you're using and use that as inspiration for what you're doing. So those are those 2 books, and they're meant for K through 12 educators. So My Sandwich is a Spaceship came when my children were young. And I think they were 3 and 5 when I actually published the book. And it came because people typically think of early childhood as being highly creative for children. And it absolutely is. Okay. And I tell a story about, my child putting together oranges and ketchup and thinking that was delicious. Right. And at the same time, he wouldn't eat any mozzarella or pizza. He would just, have all these weird concoctions he would put together. But what can happen at that early age is that we start to give them templates. So I'll give you an example of that. We were at the library and the librarian was having my children draw sheep. And they had little puffs of cotton balls that you put on the sheep. And when my son finished, the librarian came over to me and said, "Don't worry, we'll fix it later." And I'm like, "Fix it later? What do you mean fix it? It's fine. He's, 3. And there's so many things that can happen in early childhood that can pave the way for our children to be more curious, more open-minded, able to come up with lots of ideas or not. And so what My Sandwich is a Spaceship is about is sort of my own mom journey, along with one of my very close colleagues and friends who also is in the creativity field, where we talk about what does it mean to raise creative children and how do we raise creative children and what are some things that we can do to support their creativity. And so that's where that book came out. Funny story that when my kids were like primary school age, I think my son was in 4th grade, I actually found a sandwich in the washing machine, a full ham sandwich in the washing machine in a plastic bag. And it was done, like the washing machine was done. I opened it up And I was like, James, what's the ham sandwich? He goes, oh, Mom, I must have left it in my pocket. So I said, if I'm going to write a primary book, it's going to be, I found a sandwich in my washing machine. Creative thinking for parents with school-age children. So that's where that book came from.
So why did he have the sandwich in his pocket? See, that would have been my next question.
No idea. I think it was from like a camp lunch or something.
Oh my goodness. So tell our listeners as we wrap up where they can find you to get in touch. Website, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, all those good things.
So if you just type in creativity and education.com, you will find our website. You'll also find my contact information. I'm always happy to connect. I'm also really interested in hearing from educators in terms of what they need right now. Like, what's stopping you from bringing creativity into the classroom other than just being exhausted, which I do understand, as I mentioned. But if there's things that you would like as a listener, that you're looking for certain materials, please let me know. We are constantly building based on what we're hearing. So if you say to me, you know what we could really use is this, then I will definitely look into potentially building it or finding a team that will build it. Because that is my goal in creativity and education, is to build out those possibilities for teachers and parents. I also have a Fueling Creativity podcast where my co-host and I, my co-host Matt Warwood, who is he has Dads for Creativity. He and I, we interview scholars in the field of creativity research, and we interview educators and practitioners, and our sole focus is, so how do we actually bring this into the classroom? And we have a creativity YouTube station, and you can find that on our website as well with Barney Salzberg. And I think that's it.
Okay, that's great. And so all of our listeners, as usual, we will have all of Cyndi's information and links and ways you can purchase her books and find her on the description page. So Cyndi, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. It was a great conversation, and I'm just so impressed with the work that you're doing to keep creativity in the classroom. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Christy. And I really appreciate the work you're doing as well.
And this is Christy Houle signing off for this episode of Classroom Matters.